For that, just for the fact that we're all back. Seriously. Yeah, we were in a little kitchen and there were 50 people packed in there 3 years ago, and all of a sudden something happened. Now we're back and we're in this space here in RSP Architects, which is absolutely amazing, a beautiful space. We are up on the 4th floor in this little, I call it a turret, in a building that is essentially a castle to beer. Grain Belt Brewery building, right? Beautiful space. And we have our first 2 guests back in person. We have Frank Rose, who is currently at University of Columbia. Is that right?
Columbia University.
Columbia University. Don't get those reversed. And of course, someone you all might know or have heard of before, because he's been on our platform a number of times, because he keeps asking every time. He's like, can I be on there again? I got one in first. Okay, I did. I got that one in first. No, he came to us because of another friend who's been on the program at the National Gallery of Arts, Eric Bruce. He brought up the idea of Frank Rose paired up with Mr. Joe Pine, and we said that would be amazing as a wonderful pairing, right? And so that's how they came together, and we're going to have a wonderful conversation about immersive experiences, as perhaps a few other tangents, and questions from the audience at any given point in time after we get through at least a few of our questions, because we've got ours already set up, right? Any other details I haven't covered, other than the fact that this is put on by Capsule, and hopefully in the near future, a few sponsors, but for sure by Capsule here in Minneapolis. Kitty?
If you don't know me, my name is Kitty Hart, and I am the Vice President of Brand Experience at Heroic Productions. So I'm happy to be here co-hosting. Is this audio okay? Okay, great. Thank you, Erin, for letting me co-host. So some of you might know I was at Capsule for 10 years. I've been gone for a little while. Now at Heroic Productions, a little bit about us. We produce in-person, virtual, and hybrid events for big corporations. So really excited to have the conversation today about immersive experiences. It's right at the center of what we do. And I know that most people here in the audience today, a lot of marketers, a lot of corporate leaders, this is a very interesting topic as we dig into immersive experiences. So I'm going to kick us off here with some introductions. I was telling Joe before we started that oftentimes we let our speakers or our guests introduce themselves, but I find that they don't really toot their own horns as much as they should. So
we're humble.
Right.
So I am going to give a little bit of intro to each of them. And then I will also ask you to add anything that I've left out. So Joe Pine, internationally acclaimed author, speaker, and advisor to Fortune 500 companies, as well as entrepreneurial startups. Co-founder of Strategic Horizons. I love that you describe Strategic Horizons as a thinking studio. I think that's a fabulous descriptor. Co-author of The Experience Economy, Infinite Possibility, Authenticity, and Mass Customization. So what else would you like our audience to know before we get started?
Not a lot. I'll say I do live here in Minnesota in Stillwater. I used to live in Delwood and grew up in Apple Valley. I'm not native to Minnesota. Moved here when I was 11, I think it was, and but lived here most of my life. But because I moved around a lot, I'm a New York Yankees, Los Angeles Lakers, and Green Bay Packers fan. So I enjoyed the game last Sunday myself.
Did you say Green Bay Packers fan?
I said Green Bay Packers. I thought I'd give them something to, anti-root for me, and then when we start talking, then they'll come back to me.
Oh yeah, they will.
Great, thank you. And now I'd like to introduce Frank Rose. Frank is a past contributing editor and correspondent at Wired Magazine, senior fellow and faculty director at Columbia University School of Arts, author of The Art of Immersion and The Sea We Swim In, which was just published in June of 2021. He is a keynote speaker, contributor to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. So welcome, Frank. What else would you like our audience to know before we get started?
Thank you. Thank you. I think the only thing I would add is that I'm a member of the Digital Storytelling Lab at Columbia. And a few years ago, we started an awards program called the Digital Dozen, which is kind of fun. We like to show what people are doing that is kind of really out there and maybe going to point the way to something down the road.
Wonderful. Thank you. Aaron, I think the first question is yours.
Yes, and I wanted to set the base, set the foundation, set the understanding of what we're talking about. So I wanted to make sure if everybody hasn't read all of your books, because each of you are prolific in your authoring of books and, you know, writing for the New York Times. I tried to get through all of your New York Times articles, Frank, but it was a little bit too much. I couldn't get there. Only I discovered them a couple of days ago. Anyway, but I want to make sure we cover off on what is an immersive experience? Going all the way back to your book as the one quadrant or the one area of experiences, kind of set the definition, if you don't mind, for us. And then also from Frank's perspective, what is an immersive experience?
It's a fantastic topic. I actually looked at Frank's book earlier today, and the part where it talks about what is an immersive experience. I think we may mostly disagree, but the framework that Aaron mentioned is what we call our did I say mostly disagree? Is that what I said? Mostly agree, I think I meant. So the framework he's talking about is what we call our 4E model, which are the 4 different realms of experience, which are simply entertainment, educational, escapist, and aesthetic realms. And it's defined by 2 axes. And first of all is the participation axis of whether you're more or less passive or more or less active within the experience. Right? You think of passive experiences where we don't really affect what's going on that much. They sort of wash over us, as opposed to active experiences where we're involved. The experience would not be the same if we weren't there, and so forth. Right now, you're being primarily passive. I'm being primarily active. And then there's absorption versus immersion. So absorption is basically when the experience comes into you, and immersion is where you go into the experience, right? And you're basically surrounded, embedded within that experience. So passive absorption is entertainment experience. You're watching a TV show, a movie, a concert, a play, right? It's happening over there. You're bringing in the sights and sounds of it. When you get more active with that is where you can turn into an educational experience, because you're wrestling with the ideas and applying them, figuring them out, and doing homework and so forth. Then the experience of the third kind is active immersion, and that's an escapist experience where you go from one place to another. Tourism is classically escapist experiences, but escape rooms are primarily escapist experiences where you go inside of there and try and figure out how to get back outside. And then the I try. It just blinks. Yeah. Oh, it's on again. It's on. Okay, it's on again. It's just blinking. All right. So aesthetic experiences are passive immersion. So it's like going to an art gallery, right, and being immersed in the objects passively, or going into a park of some sort. And also, like, think about cafes or passive immersions. So though that defines, right, the 4 realms. Of that model is the one that academics have really gravitated to. There's been hundreds of articles published on that model and applying them to various different things. But each of those are continuums, right? That you're never really 100% passive, right? Because your brain is at least thinking and doing, when you're absorbing. And you're never 100% active. You're never totally absorbed without any immersion in some environment that you're in. And you're not totally 100% immersed as well without some looking around and thinking about what's going on. So what we say is that the most robust experiences, though, are hit the sweet spot in the middle that have elements of all of those. So there's a lot of people particularly focused on immersive theater now and so forth, where they're really focused on immersion. But what we encourage companies to do is, well, look at all 4 realms. Find your center of gravity. Like, think about escape rooms, right? Escape rooms, obviously escapist is their center of gravity. But there is, in fact, a lot of entertainment, particularly looking at the people trying to figure out other people trying to figure out the puzzles, and I can't figure it out, whether you can or not. Not that one. We're all going to share the same mic now. All right. All right, there we go. So it's also educational because you have to learn, hopefully, from each other again on how to solve puzzles. And they have a particular aesthetic design to them that does, in fact, immerse you in the place. And I always say, entertainment is about to enjoy, educational is about to learn, escapist is about to go and do, and then aesthetic is about to just be. Right, and if you get all four of those in there, the immersion along with the absorption, the passive with the active, is when you have the best and most robust experiences.
Frank.
Okay, I'm
That was
going to
everything.
offer a more holistic definition if I can. And I'm going to borrow it from Janet Murray, who's a professor at Georgia Tech, wrote an astonishing book that was published, I believe, in 1998 called Hamlet on the Holodeck. And it was, really the first book that I'm aware of that tried to get an answer of what storytelling was going to look like in the digital age. And of course, this was at the very, almost you could say the dawn of the digital age. Her definition of immersion was, to find yourself in a completely other environment, as different as water is from air. And so that's kind of the way I like to think about it. The other thing I would add to that is that, we find ourselves at a time when people are, I think, more and more eager to be immersed. And I think that's partly a function of the internet, of video games, of lots of things like that, although certainly immersion predates them. But I like to think of it as trying to get away from frames. We don't want to be in frames anymore. We don't want to be in a movie theater. We don't want to be in watching a play through a proscenium arch. We don't want even screens. Screens are something that we used to see them as a window, and I think increasingly we're seeing them as a barrier. And so what we'd like to do, I think, is to find ourselves in a place where there's nothing between us and the experience that we're having. We talk about media. Medium comes from the Latin word medium, which means in the middle. And in the middle is, the frame, is the screen, is, whatever is separating us from the totality of the experience. And so that's what I think we want to get rid of.
Okay, that's really helpful because I think we hear a lot about this word, immersive experiences, and immersive, and what does that exactly mean? So thank you, both of you, for that. When we were preparing for this, I texted Aaron a couple of days ago and I said, this is some really heady stuff. I had a really hard time wrapping my arms around it. So I would expect that many of you are feeling that way right now, even though we just had that explanation. So let's dig a little bit more into some of these questions, because then I think it will start to come together. So Frank, I'm going to pose this question to you. So we are all consuming media. We're consuming experiences through many different mediums all day long, all at the same time. In fact, so much so that we are actually creating hours in our day, right? If you can get that as a concept. So can it still be immersive if we are consuming too much? Or is that the definition of immersive?
I would say no, it can't. I think, I'm just going to take a wildfire here, but I feel like being immersed means that your attention is really focused on whatever it is that you're immersed in, whether passively or actively, as Joe said. I think if you're multitasking, almost by definition, you're not immersed.
Okay, so back to Joe and this pandemic thing that happened and the value of time and understanding the value of time and experiences, which we wrote about in our book, The Physics of Brand. I thought you were going to say something there. No. Okay. We already were becoming more and more aware of the importance of time and where we spend our time. Can you talk a little bit about how that's accelerated and understanding of time and time well spent? Because you were recently quoted in some, I don't even know, Fast Company or somewhere about that. Yeah.
Yes, I think one of the most important things to understand as business people and as people is that the most precious resource on the planet is the time of individual human beings. And it's a terrible thing to waste, right? And companies do that all the time, is that they waste our time, right? And voice response hell and sitting in queues and doing things that are unnecessary. My favorite example is with hospitals, where you even emergency room or hospital, a doctor's office, often you go in there and the first thing they do is they ask you for information that they already have, right? Just like, why are we doing this? And they're also, hospitals are geared towards the efficiency of the doctors, not the time of the patients. So the first thing to do is find ways to stop wasting time and get up to at least a level of time well saved. And time well saved is what services do, right? Services save our time. We have how many people here change their own oil in their car? Right? Yeah. I remember when I first started asking that question 25 years ago, there'd always be like 3 or 4 people. And now I changed the oil once in my car. The first, time it needed changing, when I got my first car back in the 1980s, and said, thank you very much. I'm never doing that again. Right? It's a waste of time because there's so many other things you'd be doing. Even if you're sitting there having it done, right? You could be reading, you could be talking, you could be immersed in all these games if that's what you want. And so we have to stop wasting time. One of the best in the world at getting rid of wasted time is the Walt Disney Company. Think about in their theme parks, they were the first ones to snake lines, right? So that you can now people watch, which is an entertaining experience to watch other people and so forth. One of the things they do is that if they tell you it's 30 minutes between this point and the ride, it's less than 20. I do, but it's less than 20 because they want you to get to the point where, well, that wasn't very long after all, right? Because you're expecting 30. The way that they get, the ride never stops. They get people on, they get people off, right? All in the same process as a way of not wasting time. Using a magic band to be able to get into the park rather than having to wait in line to get in when you want to be in, right? So let's make that go as quickly as possible. And of course, they're the best in the world at time well spent as well, which is what experience is about. Time well spent, that people value the experience that they have with you, that's what they're buying from you is their time. And so when you get into going beyond goods and services to staging experiences, you need to design time. You need to design the time that people spend with you. And then there's one more level above that, which is time well invested. When you have experiences that people go through that are actually investing their time now, that pays compound interest and dividends now and into the future. And this is the realm of what we call transformations, where you help people achieve their aspirations through the experiences that they have. Fitness centers are really in the transformation business. Healthcare, B2B management consultants in the transformation business, where customers are coming to them and say, I have an aspiration, I have this desire to change, I'm finding it really hard to do it on my own, will you please help me? Is essentially what that is. And you provide that time well best invested. So time is just like one of the most crucial things to understand about in business. And so if I can ask Frank a question, right? I'm always influenced by famed architect John Jurdy, who's like actually designed the Mall of America. He's one of the first experience architects, as well as Fremont Street Experience and the Bellagio in Las Vegas and so forth. And he said what experience design is the design of time. Right, that's what it is. It's the time that people spend in a place is what he talks about. And Frank, you spend a lot of time talking about dramatic structure and this design of time in one of the chapters of your book. I forget which one of the principles it is, but I thought it might be good for you to talk a little bit about that and extend that notion of time well spent as designing time.
Right. No, that's an interesting idea. So, there are a number of sort of classic, classic narrative structures, and the one that I find most compelling and most interesting is the 3-act narrative. Let's see, I forget exactly what it's called. The Freytag's pyramid, I believe it is, after a German writer in the 19th century named
Gustav Freytag.
Freytag, right, who did this sort of diagram. And essentially, what you have is, an opening act, a middle act, and a concluding act. And the middle act is sort of the bulk of it. And that's when you have, multiple things happen that build up to some sort of crisis. And at the end of that act, the crisis is resolved, and or rather, the crisis is reached. And in the following act, in Act 3, the crisis is resolved. So, that's something that can be applied to all sorts of things. I mean, it's sort of a classic structure of Hollywood movies that goes all the way back to Aristotle, but it can be applied to and used in ads. It can be, used in, really any kind of experience. And I think the reason it's so effective is that it sort of forces people into a series of events. You're following these events, whether you're reading them or watching them or experiencing them yourself, you're following these events, and they are designed to, sort of maximize emotional engagement at different points, and again, coming to a climax. And emotion, I think, is sort of the lingua franca of stories. And I think that's why people in business sometimes have trouble with stories. I think that, business people are, tend to think in terms of logic and reasoning and numbers, perhaps, and so forth. And that's fine. And it's gotten us to the moon, literally, but it's not a way to tell an effective story. And so I think that's something that, really has to be kept in mind if you are, if you're trying to motivate people. You really.
Love that, Frank. That was, yeah, the more we talk about, the more we go deeper into places that get almost underwater. And we'll start talking about whether fish know water. We're going to have that. Yeah, right. There's a debate about that going on, but I'll hand the mic over to Kitty for the next question.
So what was just described here is like a stage production, right? We're designing these experiences, and it's very much like a stage production as we tell the story. So let's talk a little bit more. Let's go even deeper on this. And Frank, for some reason, I'm asking all the questions to Frank, and you're asking, it's just how it worked out. But you have delved deep into artificial intelligence and neuroscience as it relates to immersive experiences. So we'd like to talk a little bit more about that and what has been discovered as far as the study of brain activity when people are immersed in an experience. a theatrical experience, listening to music, something like that. What has been discovered, and can you talk just a little bit about that?
Sure. You know, it's only, I mean, from my point of view, this all relates to, you know, the study of stories and how stories work in the brain. And there's you know, obviously what we're doing here is sort of creating an illusion between stories and experiences, which is totally fine because that's kind of what they are. What happens with stories, it's interesting to me actually that it's only in the last 20 years or so that psychologists and you know, cognitive psychologists and neuroscientists and so forth have you know, even tried to study stories and how they work in the brain. What, you know, originally, or I should say earlier, it was just sort of considered frivolous, you know, like stories are, you know, movies and TV shows, and why should we study that? You know, it's just entertainment and it doesn't really matter. You know, what they've found is that stories are, you know, basically how we make sense of the world. And, you know, the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that we tell each other, the stories that we, you know, get from TV and, you know, from our friends and from all kinds of things. So it's really, you know, stories kind of define our reality. But there have been some very interesting experiments that have been done. I won't go into the details, but, you know, just sort of the top line takeaway is that we seem to process stories by projecting ourselves into them imaginatively. And that has several, you know, consequences. One is that we are much more likely to be immersed in a story if we find that, if we identify with the main character or at least one of the main characters in the story. If there's nobody in the story that we can identify with, we tend not to, you know, really go there. You know, another thing that's been discovered is that we, you know, even though we tend to identify with people who resemble ourselves, if they are very different from us, say if you're reading a story and you discover, you learn that the main character is Black and you're white, it makes a big difference if you learn this right away in like the first page, or if you learn this in page 3 or 4 or 10 or whatever. And, you know, that's because, you know, once you have invested some, you know, like emotional engagement in a character, and you become aware that this person is different from you, it doesn't really make as much difference as it would otherwise. So this was something that was a technique that was used in the Broadway play A Chorus Line, which was was produced in the 1970s. And it was, of course, a backstage play about, you know, people in Broadway musicals. And naturally, a certain amount of them were gay, but this was a time when, you know, being gay was not nearly as accepted as it is now. So this was a technique that they used for the actors, you know, portraying these parts to have the audience, you know, bond with the actors before they were able to make any, you know, sort of prejudicial judgments, perhaps.
Love that.
I love the historical moments in time being brought into this conversation. That's one of the things that's been really helpful to me as I've been doing the research to leading up to today.
Yeah, and I can strongly endorse Frank's books on this. The Art of Immersion and The Sea We Swim In both have an incredible depth into this subject area. It's really fascinating. We're not going to go to the avatar question because we do have to cover that at some point in time, because I'm curious if Frank has actually seen the new avatar or not. But I do want to, again, I'm back to you and your around health and wellness and happiness and this concept and the contribution that immersive experiences do, or that relationship that people have with organizations that provide that, or are helping people on their journey. Another area that you were quoted in recently, and our local Nancy O'Brien identified that for us as something we should bring up and question and be curious about. So can you talk more about that as it relates to well-being and happiness?
Yes. Just went red. It was green the whole time. All right. So, yeah, so in healthcare and well-being, they really are at that transformation level I talked about. It's help getting people to understand what their aspirations are regarding their health, and to help them get on a journey, get on a path where they can get to a place of well-being. So many hospitals and other healthcare organizations, they tend to treat the symptoms, rather than the actual person. And you need to get to who this actual person is, right? Why they want this, and help them achieve that aspiration, right? And often it's really what we might think is a non-healthcare aspiration. One of the stories I often tell is about my mother-in-law, who actually discovered she had pancreatic cancer. And when she discovered it was stage 4, so there just wasn't that much time. They basically said, you've got like 6 months. And there's things we can do to try to extend that and so forth. And so they're talking all these healthcare things. And she very smartly, she said, look, my oldest granddaughter is getting married in September. All I want is to be at the wedding looking beautiful. That's all I want. And so that's what they worked on, which is a wonderful aspiration to have. She knew she wasn't in for the long term. So she made it to the wedding. She looked beautiful, and 2 weeks later she died. Right? It was just, that's where we need to think about who this person is and what they're really trying to achieve, rather than just treat symptoms of them.
Yeah, well, that was profound. I know for me it works. That was absolutely, yeah. Anything to add to that, Frank?
No, I'm afraid not. But it's a great story.
Okay.
Thank you, Joe.
That was profound enough. That was a mic drop moment.
How are we doing on time? Are there any questions from the audience? Because we can certainly open it up. I'm going to come to you.
It's for the people online.
2 parts. What's the difference between engagement and immersion? Secondly, as far as the brain research in this area, storytelling, I don't know if you're familiar that Yale did some research and found that students in a classroom, when they were getting the straight verbal instruction, but it was switched to storytelling, everything went to the right hemisphere. We have 2 brain hemispheres, and the emotionality of things in storytelling, as opposed to the logic and reasoning and numbers, as you were talking about, Frank, is all in the right hemisphere. But education is so much is just focused on the left hemisphere. That's why storytelling is just kind of dismissed. It's in a domain that's largely ignored. But anyway, that was a comment, the question about engagement and immersion.
Frank.
Joe, do you want to take that, or?
No, I think you should take it.
Okay. Okay.
She
So
used your name, not mine.
oh, okay. Sorry. So yeah, to my mind, there are sort of 2 kinds of immersion, and one is newer than the other. And I'm not entirely sure how. Joe and I haven't actually compared notes on this, so I'm not entirely sure how this maps to Joe's idea that you laid out earlier. But to my mind, the sort of classic kind of immersion is I think maybe what you would call absorption, where you're the classic example would be, you're reading a book and you get so absorbed, so immersed in the characters and in the plot that you forget your train stop, and you look up and you're 40 miles past your destination. So that's what I think of as a classic form of immersion. But lately, and which is to say in the last 40 years or so, a much more active form of immersion has come out, and that's what I think could be called engagement. The example of that would be, say, an alternate reality game, or really any kind of game where you're where you're sort of actively contributing to it and contributing to the story and sort of helping to create the story. Escape rooms, obviously, anything like that. To my mind, that's really a second and a newer kind of immersion. We've had engagement for many decades, if not centuries, too. But what I'm really talking about here is essentially engagement with the story, and so that's what I would consider a sort of more recent and more active kind of immersion.
Yeah, I wanted Frank to go first, so I could completely disagree with him. No, not actually. That actually is very related, but I think of the 4E model I talked about before, where immersion is the bottom half versus absorption. All of it is engagement, right? Engagement is the key word. That with experiences, you're engaging people, you're reaching inside of them, right, and engaging them. That's where the experience actually happens. Experiences happens inside of us in reaction to the events that are staged in front of us. And so it is really a key word to think about, is how do you engage people, and recognize too that you engage people emotionally, and that's the highest, I mean, not the highest level, but it's the most frequent, right? You engage people emotionally. You can engage them physically, like with a fitness center and so forth. You engage them intellectually, and purely on a reason basis, you can engage people, and you engage people spiritually. Right, so one of those four ways, and one or more of each of those four ways in any experience.
We have another question.
Joe and Frank, first off, thank you for this. This has been really interesting. How do you see emerging AI technologies, whether it's ChatGPT or other things like that, impacting individual engagement with whether it's consumer brands or activities, things that we're all trying to think about from a business perspective?
I'll give a short answer and let Frank go. I mean, it's a huge issue right now. And one of the things that I increasingly think about is the fact that Chat GP and DALL-E and all that, they are basically, put this in quotes, stealing, right, the intellectual property, or at least the intellectual output of so many different people, and doing things in the style of and so forth. So I can imagine you could say, design a experience in the style of Walt Disney, right? And design a ride and have something, it'll pop something out that really will be pretty good. If not now, shortly in the future. So those are the sort of issues I think about, and it's even more so. You got the issue of AI creating deep fakes, where you don't know if this person really is saying what they're saying, and if an experience you're having with somebody. There are sites you can go to and pay celebrities to sing happy birthday to you and call your best friend and things like that. Well, pretty soon they won't have to do any work. They'll just take the money and have their deep fake do it.
Right. Joe, I totally agree with what you say. Actually, an example of Chat GPT, for example, of that, trying to fake, a story, a song, or whatever. Nick Cave, I recently came across something where somebody had done a Chat GPT version of a Nick Cave song. And his response was, this is crap, And I think the reason for that, aside from, maybe he would be somewhat defensive, but aside from that, the truth is that ChatGPT and DALL-E, they don't know anything. They have quote unquote learned from being trained quote unquote on multiple different millions of different texts or images in the case of DALL-E, but they have no consciousness. They don't know what they're doing. All they're really doing is, algorithmically determining what word should come after the word that just came before. And that's, sometimes as a writer, I've felt that way myself. But nonetheless, that's not really expressing yourself. That's not really, doing anything. I feel like, we're going to be seduced by these things before we understand, most of us, that they're really just a shell. There's not a lot of there, even at this point. I mean, as I said, we at Columbia Digital Storytelling Lab, we have an awards program. We've been, giving awards for several years now for different types of AI related stories, and they've gotten more and more sophisticated. Certainly ChatGPT is far more sophisticated than the sort of thing we were looking at 4 years ago, but they still don't know what they're doing, and it's unlikely, I think it's unlikely that they ever will. We haven't been able to really define consciousness in humans, much less in machines. So, I'm not quite sure where this is going to take us, but I suspect it's going to take us into a sort of emotional place where we, have faith or get afraid of, or whatever our response is to these AIs, without, really realizing that there's, as I say, not a lot of there.
Yeah, not a lot of imagination, right? Scary, but still, I don't know that it's ever real if there's no imagination, right?
I've done these. I know I need a mic. So I want to push a little bit on the chat GPT thing, because I had a similar question to the crossover of time well invested, kind of what we started the conversation with. And so we did see that CNET pretty publicly got shamed for writing articles with AI in a very poor way, which we all felt very vindicated, especially those of us with a journalism degree like me. And then you see actual studies that come as it relates to mental health and mental health services. And there was a online telehealth provider that did provide telehealth services where the respondents were more pleased with the responses that they got from ChatGPT and AI. That changed very dramatically when those folks were aware that they were being treated by a robot, right? But I would be really interested in both of your kind of thoughts as you look through this philosophical argument as it relates to time well invested, as well as we know that we don't have nearly enough mental health providers, where there's people that are saying that the robots are doing better than the machine learning is doing better than the people. How do you guys feel about all that?
Alexa, I have a mental health issue.
Right. In one sense, I always think that it provides value to customers, then it's something that that you can do. And obviously, a lot of companies can save costs on it. But the authenticity of it is, in fact, very important to your perception. That's why as soon as they know it is, right, it goes way down. You remind me too of the big issue of, you don't see it quite as much now, but it's been around for like a decade, particularly in Japan, where they don't have enough service workers, particularly for elder people, because they're a very old society. And so they've created these seal robots, right, to make people feel better. And a lot of people decry them. And I'm like, well, if they don't have the workers and it makes them feel better, I'm sort of okay with that. And it reminds me of another, an MIT professor I know, Sherry Turkle, just wonderful analysis of what's going on. She came out with a book, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago called Alone Together. And she was particularly talking about how she'd be in the same room with her daughter and they'd be alone together, right? They're each doing their own things on that. And this is sort of how my brain works. I immediately said alone together, that's a 2x2 matrix, right? You got alone, alone, you got alone together, you got together alone, you got together together. And so I said, so alone together, sure, it's not as good as together together, but it's a lot better than alone alone. And together alone is just sad, right? So you know, it's we have to work our way through these as society changes and so forth.
We got to get Frank's view on that because that was real.
You know, a number of years ago, I interviewed Robert A.M. Stern, the architect. He was on the board of Disney at the time, and he was one of the key people, if not the key person, who convinced Michael Eisner, who was then CEO, to invest in 42nd Street, the New Amsterdam Theater, which you know, they've been using ever since, quite successfully. And the point that he was making was about Starbucks. And his point was, you know, why do we think people go to Starbucks and spend, you know, a couple of hours with their laptop sitting in the company of other people whom they, you know, for the most part don't know, and aren't even going to engage with, you know. And what he said was, you know, don't we think you can make coffee at home? Well, sure, you can make coffee at home, but that means you're alone, as Joe would put it. And to be alone together is definitely preferable to being alone. And sometimes it's even preferable to being together than to being together. Depends on who you're being together with.
We have another question from the audience.
Hi, say, this is a question related to both the whole idea of storytelling and also transformation. And it's kind of a question about balancing the story of how you get to the transformation versus the benefit, the end result of the transformation. So, and how that relates to marketing. So I work for a company that does virtual healthcare for people with COPD. And we have a number of like pilots and studies and all this stuff getting ready to launch with some big clients and things. And it's up to me to figure out all the marketing. So I know that storytelling is such a valuable piece of the puzzle. And I know that because whenever the employees hear this stuff, it's like, oh, tears. Oh, you know, I mean, we just know the effect that we have on people. And we see the joy that people experience from this transformation. Today, I had an interview with Phyllis from Jersey City, and she talked about how, like, the changes that happened in her life, that she was a shut-in pretty much, and then she wanted to be able to walk up her street. That was her big goal without getting winded and, you know, feeling like she couldn't do it. And then she wanted to go to the park and all this kind of stuff. So, but what struck me is not just the end result, but her experience of going through the process of getting to where she wanted to be. And so I don't know that there's a magical formula, but what are your thoughts on, you know, how much you promote the experience and the joy of the transformation itself versus how much you promote the end result of, I feel good and now I can do all these things? Because we've got this 30-minute video. Nobody's going to listen to a 30-minute video. You've got to like pick and choose what goes into that video. But I hear every bit of it and I'm like, I love it all. Like, I don't know if you have thoughts on that process versus benefit within a transformation and in a story.
Yes. That's classic. One of the things I learned from my father early on is the answer to every question is it depends. And in that case, it may depend on the individual person and how they want to think about it themselves. And so you may have to do a diagnosis of them to see how. But the storytelling aspect of putting, as Frank talked about, there's a story being able to walk down the street and you put yourself in there as the protagonist, you identify with it. They can learn, well, here's how other people have done, here's their stories. And if they can identify them, they can make it easier for them to follow that same sort of path. I'm also reminded of research that's been done that says that if people can envision their future self, then they'll make better decisions today. Right. And so, and like Merrill Lynch did this with this aging thing. I don't know if you ever saw that like 10 years ago, that you'd put a photo up there and it'd age your photo to every 5 years to you're 65. And the idea is like, this is who you are at 65. Is this how you want to look? Is this, what your finances going to be? And you make better decisions today if you imagine that. Well, if you take not just an image of how you look, but a story of what your life is like, including like scenario planning. Well, here are 4 different stories of what your life could be like at age 65, or even like, well, in a month or 2, if it's getting to walk down to the corner and so forth, then I think the importance of that story and the level of engagement it gives can very much help a lot of people in terms of making that happen. I'm a big proponent of telehealth as well. Frank, you got anything to add?
Yeah, first off, I'm a big proponent of telehealth too. I think it's great. Personally, I'm more concerned with the results, I think, but it depends on the situation. The experience of having physical therapy, for example, is going to be very different from the experience of having chemo. So I know it's hard to generalize, but all of life is an experience, and we, as Joe pointed out, we tend to waste a lot of our time, and we allow companies to waste even more of it. But anything that anything that sort of takes you into a zone where you're having what you consider to be, I guess, a beneficial experience, or even better, exciting, whatever adjective you'd like to use, sort of experience is great. And I guess if you can achieve your result, maybe that's the gravy. I don't know. I think I've sort of reversed my position here, but I think that's probably because it's really hard to say what's better. They both have to be good. You can have a good experience is not going to matter a lot if it results in a bad outcome, and vice versa.
Thank you, Frank. We have one more question from the audience.
Hi, I would like to say just thank you again. This has been so fascinating as someone who kind of has a little bit of a background in neuroscience. So one of my favorite books is The Feeling of What Happens by Antonio Damasio, who has really extensively studied consciousness as it relates to brain injury and how each specific part of the brain is affected in consciousness. He also brought up the theme of autobiographical self, the stories that we tell ourselves are how we craft identity. And in marketing, in business, I guess if we think of experience as the seeds of stories and stories as the seeds to the autobiographical self, what is the moral obligation for businesses and marketing to craft truthful, first and foremost, but also great storytelling as it relates to the autobiographical self, and as we move forward into more AR, VR, and AI?
You want to take that, Frank, to start?
Well, I think if I did, I would talk about authenticity. So I think I would pass that on to you, Jeff.
Okay. That's one of the other books I've written is directly on authenticity. And since I've talked so much about 2x2s, I can't help but give you the key 2x2 there, which is economic offerings, right? They can be fake, real, or real, right? Those are sort of like that alone together model where it just sort of pops out when you think about real and fake. And authenticity is also personally determined, right? We decide for ourselves what is authentic to ourselves, and somebody can try to convince us otherwise, but it's up to us to determine that. And authenticity is hugely important in business. It basically coincides with the experience economy, right? Even though it affects all economic offerings, because with the experience economy, again, I mentioned that they happen inside of us. Well, then the things we absorb into our being, right? We want to be authentic to us. Not just our experiences, but our, organic produce. That's why it first happened there, because we ingest them. They become part of our being. Cosmetics and lotions and all that, they on our skin, they become part of us and so forth. So experiences and transformations are the most things, right? I talked about experiences happen inside of us. Transformations change us from the inside out, right? It's about being very individual with them. So it doesn't mean you can't tell stories that are not about that individual person, but ones they can identify with. It also doesn't mean all your stories have to be true, right? Because while I said real, fake, real, fake, and fake, it's really hard to be really real, right? To be real. And often it's easier to be a fake real or a real fake, and that's where stories can come in. In fact, quit laughing at my model. In fact, Disneyland, right, or Disney World is fake real. Why? It's a fake reality. Right, it's really not the Magic Kingdom. If they sprinkle pixie dust on you, you're really not going to fly, and that's not really Mickey Mouse there, and so forth. But they do a wonderful job of being true to self, right? And that's the basic models. They're not what they say they are. It's not the Magic Kingdom, but it's true to self. And you can create stories in that same way. There are many, like the one that immediately comes to mind is Haagen-Dazs, right? Which they named because it sounded Danish and vaguely Scandinavian, and it's from Brooklyn, right? And it just existed out of whole cloth when it seemed like they'd start importing the stuff, from the old countries. And that can work. You need to do it in a good way. You need to do it in a way that you're not trying to hide what the reality is. But people are more than happy to have fun and play with things. That's why even fake things like faux furs or faux fireplaces and so forth really work. It's one of the principles of authenticity is that if you don't like something, you call it fake, but if you do like it, you call it faux.
That's a very good point, I think. But I mean, what we're really ultimately talking about is, like maybe we should let the Kardashians decide, what's fake and what's real.
You've gone too far.
Yeah, way too far. I want to do another 2x2 model. So rose and pine, right? We could have rose and rose or pine and pine. We chose to have pine and rose, right? Which is much better, which is a nice conclusion to today's discussion, right? Thank you both for doing this, for participating in our first hybrid, which doesn't feel like a Prius. It actually feels nice. Nothing against Priuses, but thank you for pulling this off with us and being a good audience and having a lot of really good questions. It was amazing. We have next month, we have the Museum of Ice Cream and a local retail influencer and really interesting character we'll have on the stage. That'll be fun. Any other things to add to this conversation? Because you've had a lot. Mic drop moments.
So I'll just say one of the things I always ask companies to think about is what business are they really in? Right? If you understand what business you're really in, right? And you got 5 choices. You can be in the commodities business, you can be the goods business, you can be the service business, you can be the experience business, or you can be in the transformation business. And while not everybody has to shift up, you will gain a lot of benefit if you go beyond goods and experiences, goods and services to experiences and transformations.
Margin and more margin. Yeah, that's great. And thank you, Kitty, for participating as my co-host.
You're very
and
welcome.
Of course, Frank, you were amazing. Can I put a plug in again for your books and for your workshop? at Columbia University that you also teach at with him, right? As a guest lecturer, Frank?
Yes. That's Joe. Joe is, as often as we can get him, we love to have Joe as a speaker.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. A lot of applause. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.